I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI. Thanks you all so much for taking the time to join us today for, I think, what is going to be a really interesting and really evocative conversation with University of Virginia President Jim Ryan. The topic today is, should universities be more like corporations? I think Jim has a take on it, which is, fun and might take this in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Look, here's the rationale for today's event. It's well understood that American higher education has come under fire on a number of fronts. There's concerns about speech on campus. There's concerns about civility. There's concerns about issues like affordability and access. Question is, what do you do about all of this? One of the more interesting places to try to sort these conversations out is the University of Virginia. Everybody in this room, I suspect, can remember the events of Charlottesville a couple of years past, when Unite the Right rally led to horrific violence, weeks of national discourse about the state of what was going on in our fraying social fabric. UVA, of course, Thomas Jefferson's University, is in Charlottesville. Jim Ryan was not president at that time. He was named the 9th president of the University of Virginia shortly after. I've known Jim a little over 20 years. I started out, my first job as an academic was a professor of education at the University of Virginia. Jim was hired, I think, the same year as a new professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. So we've had the chance to know each other for 20 plus years. I've had a chance to watch Jim's contributions, with great admiration. He went on to be dean of the Harvard University Graduate School of Education, where in classic Jim Ryan fashion, he gave a commencement address, which went viral, led to a major book offer. And I remember Jim saying, yeah, I got talked into writing this book because, the advance was large enough. I'm like, it's a good problem we all should have. Anyway, Jim was lured back to become the 9th president of the University of Virginia. And one of the things I think he's wrestling with is the role of the university, not just how do we do the blocking and tackling of academia, of teaching and research and service effectively, but what should be the models of universities looking forward, especially flagship institutions like UVA has so long been. With that, let me just give you a couple of rules of the road for the day, and then I'm going to turn it over. First, if you're on Twitter, the event hashtag is CorporationU. That's CorporationU, capital C, capital U. Please feel free to chime in with questions or comments from wherever you are. The event is being live streamed, of course, for all of you who are watching at home. Feel free to jump on via Twitter. And everybody, those here and those watching at home, will be able to find the full event video at aei.org about 24 hours after the event. I'm asking if folks would please take a moment to turn off or silence all cell phones. And the format for the afternoon is going to be remarkably simple. Jim's going to share some thoughts. I'm going to ask him a few follow-up questions. Then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. With that, let me turn it over to President Ryan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Any UVA alums here? Oh, awesome. Okay, this is like an alumni event. I'll be fundraising after this, so I hope to see you at the reception. So Rick, thanks for the introduction. I want to thank AEI for inviting me and to thank Rick and your colleagues for the great work you do in the education space. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on a Thursday afternoon. I know that there are many other more pleasant ways you could spend the next hour, and so I'm happy and grateful that you're sacrificing this hour to spend with me. I'll do my best to make it worth your while. So as Rick said, I am the 9th president of the University of Virginia. Some of you may wonder how a university that is 200 years old can only have 9 presidents. It's not because we all serve for a really long period of time. It's because Thomas Jefferson actually didn't believe that UVA should have a president, and so it was for over 100 years. This is a fact I think about nearly every day because UVA seemed to have done just fine for a century without a president. And when I don't think about it, someone reminds me of the fact. So I've been president now for about a year and a half, which means that I'm qualified to stand up here today and tell you what I think about higher education. I will give you the license to do what my kids usually do when I talk, which is to either roll your eyes or ignore me completely. Before I talk a little bit about the topic, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I got here. Rick gave you a little bit of my background, but the real reason I'm standing here is because of rugby, and I'll explain. So I was planning to go to Berkeley Law School when I had an offer to go play rugby in New Zealand and Australia as part of a team that was traveling from New England. And I decided that I would stay on after the tour, which would require me to defer going to Berkeley. And I wrote them a letter asking to defer so I could join this rugby tour, and they wrote back and said, you can't defer. We only allow deferrals in the event of unforeseen family crises. And I thought, if I had only known the rule, I would have written a very different letter. That's how I knew I wanted to go to law school. Anyway, when I came back, I applied more broadly. I got into UVA and got a scholarship and decided to go there. And that began my career at UVA. I had never planned to be a law professor. A professor of mine suggested it, and I had grown used to not doing anything in the summer, and so I thought this is something worth looking into. And so I did become a law professor after clerking. And I became very interested in the topic of law and education, which is how Rick and I first met each other. And I was consumed by a question that in some respects still occupies me today, which is why did the public education system work for me when it has failed so many others? I grew up in a small blue-collar town in northern New Jersey. Neither of my parents went to college. I went to public schools in my hometown and had some teachers who took an interest in me, and my parents cared a great deal about education. I was lucky enough to go to Yale as an undergraduate, and it totally changed my life. And to me, the public education system worked just the way it's supposed to. And so when I was a law professor, I spent most of my time researching the general topic of how does law structure educational opportunity. And so looked at topics like school desegregation, school finance, school choice, special education. Out of the blue, I had an opportunity to become the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I had been associate dean at the law school at UVA, and the one conclusion I drew from that experience was that I never wanted to be in higher education administration. I took the job at Harvard because it seemed an opportunity to have a better impact and a greater impact than I could have as a law professor. And I spent 5 great years there. It's a pretty amazing place. It's very mission-driven. The offer to come back to UVA as president was also out of the blue, but one of the big things driving me was the sense that this is yet another opportunity to have an impact on education, in this instance, higher education. So that gives you a sense of how I came to be here. Now to the topic about whether universities should be more like corporations. I have to say this is not a speech I really expected to give. In fact, I'm often more inclined to talk about the ways that corporations might want to be more like universities, at least when it comes to long-term success. A little appreciated fact is that there are almost 900 American colleges and universities that are more than a century old, still in operation today, including 23 of the top 25. The Harvard Corporation is actually the oldest corporation in the Western Hemisphere, founded in 1650, and Harvard is still doing pretty well as far as I can tell. Meanwhile, the average age of a company on the S&P 500 has fallen from almost 60 years in the 1950s to less than 20 years today. And of the 25 top companies by revenue, only 4 were founded before 1990. So obviously universities are doing something pretty well when it comes to longevity. But there's at least one lesson that I think universities can learn from corporations, and that's what I want to talk about today. And that's the increasing importance of striving to be what you might call both great and good. For most of its history, the overriding purpose of corporations has been to maximize shareholder value, an idea that's often though not always synonymous with maximizing profits. As Milton Friedman said, there's one and only one social responsibility of business: to engage in activities designed to increase its profits. But as you probably know, over the last year, and especially over the last few months, that conventional wisdom has begun to shift. A few examples. In August, the Business Roundtable, a group of nearly 200 CEOs of major companies, declared that the purpose of corporations should go beyond maximizing profits and include investing in their employees, the environment, and surrounding communities. Last month, Citi launched a $150 million fund to invest in companies with a positive impact on society. Microsoft pledged to become carbon negative by 2030. And BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, announced that going forward, it will be investing in companies that focus on sustainability and disinvesting from companies that don't. Now, some of this shift is due to pressure. According to a study by the High Lantern Group, for example, the issue of climate change generated the highest degree of public pressure on corporations by activists, policymakers, and journalists last year. There's also positive incentives on companies to focus on improving the world around them. To give you one example, in December, the research firm Just Capital rated the largest U.S. companies on different qualities that appeal to most Americans. The companies that scored highest on doing good things, like Microsoft and IBM, had a higher return on equity than companies that didn't. As Rick would remind you, this is correlation, not causation. But it's not difficult to see or understand how a thriving community, happy employments, and a healthy environment could be good for the overall bottom line for businesses. So in some ways, the fact that corporations are focusing on what I'm calling being both great and good is not that surprising. Nonetheless, it's still instructive for universities. Like corporations, and here's the connection, like corporations, universities have for centuries defined their missions fairly consistently and somewhat narrowly: discover and disseminate knowledge, prepare students for some combination of citizenship, leadership, and employment. These remain vital goals, not just for universities, but for the health of our democracy, and they deserve strong support and protection. Nothing that I'm going to say should take away from that. But universities, like corporations, can sometimes forget that they're also large institutions. In fact, universities are effectively small cities, complete with hospitals, police forces, and power plants. At UVA, for example, we use over 350 million kilowatt hours of electricity each year, which is enough to power almost 32,000 American homes. We emit 250,000 tons of greenhouse gases, and we generate 15,000 tons of trash. And we're home to a city mostly of 18 to 22-year-olds, which I can tell you as president is slightly terrifying. The decisions that we make as a university affect not just our own academic communities, but also the communities in which we're located and in the increasingly fragile environment around us. And yet, as we pursue our core missions of research and teaching, it can be easy to treat these other issues as secondary or lose sight of them altogether. That's why, just as some business leaders have recognized that they ought to broaden their focus, I think it's time for university leaders to do the same. Like corporations, universities are facing criticism, as Rick suggested, from an increasingly skeptical public. Last year, for example, the Pew Research Center released a report showing that only half of American adults think colleges and universities are having a positive effect on the country, while about 4 in 10 say they're having a negative effect. This is a marked increase from only several years ago. This growing disenchantment stems from a number of causes, including the higher costs of getting a degree and the resultant debt load that students bear, as well as to a sense that universities are monolithic enclaves of liberal thought. It also appears linked to a more general perception that universities are not simply elite, but elitist. And there's some truth behind this perception. To take just one statistic, while college graduation rates for middle and upper income Americans have risen dramatically over the last 50 years, today less than 15% of students from the lowest socioeconomic bracket earn a bachelor's degree by age 24. More generally, I think there's a perception that elite universities are out of touch with the world around them. In my view, If we don't start paying close attention to how we operate as institutions, that perception will undoubtedly grow. In its statement that I referred to earlier, the Business Roundtable asserts that corporations should focus on several key things: delivering value to their customers, investing in their employees, and dealing fairly and ethically with their suppliers. The statement also pledges to support that corporations should support local communities by respecting the people who live there and protecting the environment, and it promises to generate long-term value for shareholders. If you substitute students for customers and the public for shareholders, I think this same list provides a useful framework that for universities that are striving not just to be great, but also to be good. And when I say universities might want to be more like corporations, this is exactly what I mean. So let me go through the list. So the first, deliver value to students. We ought to be delivering value to our students, preparing them for their careers and for meaningful lives. This means paying attention to things like the tuition that we're charging, the net tuition, the debt that students are leaving with, and the time to graduation. We should also be focusing on the return on the investment that families make when they pay that tuition. We should be looking at factors like social mobility. Now, if you look at UVA, we do pretty well on some of these measures and not so well on others. Our graduation rate is 94%. That's the 6-year graduation rate. The national 6-year graduation rate is 60%. Our debt is below the national average. 35% of our students leave with debt, and the average debt is $25,000 compared to the national average of $35,000. When you look at social mobility, we have a lot of work to do. You're probably familiar with the work by Raj Chetty that looks at how universities are doing with respect to social mobility, and the best universities are not doing so well. At UVA, we have about 13 to 14% of Pell students, which compares unfavorably to our peers like UNC or the University of Michigan. So we have work to do in that respect. The second factor, invest in employees. For us, that means investing in faculty and investing in our staff. With respect to faculty, it means providing them the resources they need to live and to do their jobs, and sometimes it means being creative. In a place like Charlottesville, for example, if we want to attract the very best faculty, we have to be thinking about what are we going to do to help spouses of faculty find jobs. In a place like Charlottesville, that's not a simple thing to do. In the past, we just sort of figured that faculty would figure that out for themselves. We can no longer afford to do that. With our staff, we recently raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, believing that that will help us both attract and retain good staff. And we're working on creating visible pathways for our staff to spend their careers at UVA. Dealing fairly and ethically with suppliers. It's a little known fact that universities purchase an awful lot of products from different suppliers, and we can have an enormous impact on our local and state economies based on how we deal with our suppliers. And this is an opportunity to invest in our communities by looking at local suppliers. Speaking of supporting local communities by respecting the people who are in there, the people who are part of that community, this is a really critical part. I mean, one of the things that the events of August 2017 brought to the fore is that the relationship between UVA and the city of Charlottesville is not as strong as it could be. It's in our interest to have a strong relationship with the city of Charlottesville because our fates are intertwined. And so part of our efforts over the last year and a half is to figure out how to be a better neighbor to the city of Charlottesville. And one of the things that we did early on, right after I started, was bring together a community working group. Because one of the things that universities do really well is they go out into the community and they tell communities what their problems are. And communities get a little tired of hearing that. And so we brought in community members and asked them, if you had to list the top 5 issues that we might be able to work on together, what would they be? Now, if you had lived in Charlottesville like I had for 15 years, you wouldn't be surprised that the issues they raised were wages and employment, education, and healthcare and the like. But that process of bringing people in and asking, what are your top priorities, and then pledging to work together to solve them is, I think, the way to begin strengthening the relationship between UVA and Charlottesville. Or another example, some of you may have read the story about the billing and collections practices of the medical center at UVA. We had very aggressive billing and collections practices. We have now modified them to make them more generous and, frankly, more humane. Another issue, protecting the environment, that the Business Roundtable suggests corporations should focus on. So should universities. We obviously teach and study about environmental resilience, but we also have an impact on the environment. So we just unveiled a plan for sustainability. We're pledging to be carbon neutral by 2030 and fossil fuel free by 2050. Now, on the latter promise, in order to make this really have some teeth, to be fossil fuel free by 2050, I have promised our board that if we don't reach that goal, I will step down as president. Last, long-term value to the public. So corporations are pledging to have long-term value to their shareholders. We should be pledging to have long-term value to the public, especially as a public university. That means producing research that addresses some of our biggest challenges. And it means, in some respects, prioritizing research. So what we have done in our strategic plan is identify areas where we think we can make a contribution to a field that is incredibly important to society, including brain and neuroscience, environmental resilience, democracy, and precision medicine. It means preparing our students to be civically engaged, to lead and live in a globally connected and diverse world. It means being an engine of economic growth, both through our alumni and through commercializing the research that we produce. It means providing value to the public. We're providing a return on the investment that the public makes. Now, this doesn't cover everything that a university can do, but it's a useful framework to think about. It doesn't cover issues like free speech that Rick talked about, or it doesn't cover issues like athletics, but you can think about what it means to be great and good in athletics as well, or what it means to be great and good in terms of how students interact with one another. The reason why I think this is important for universities is twofold. First, I really believe that universities in the not too distant future are going to be judged differently than they are today, and that they're going to be judged based on some of these factors. They're going to be judged based on essentially the contribution that they're making to their students and to the world around them. One of the things that really puzzles me right now about rankings, and if you look at US News and World Report, you'll see this, is that there's a ranking for best universities and there's a ranking for best value universities. I think you're going to see, and I would love to see this, that those two things should be combined. That part of being best should be best value. Part of being best should be about the return on the investment. The other reason why I think this matters is that I think it's a smart thing to do for universities in terms of recruiting talent. My own view is that faculty, students, and staff are going to want to work at institutions in which they believe. That is, it's not going to be enough for us to simply say that teaching is great, there are research opportunities. More and more, I think you're going to see people wanting to be at a place that they think lives its values, that they think is not just excellent, but also ethical, and that they think is serving a higher purpose. So it's strategically important for universities, just like I think it's strategically important for businesses to focus on these topics and to focus on being not just great, but also good. Now, I should say, this doesn't mean the attempt to be great and good doesn't mean that universities are going to be perfect. We're never going to be perfect, and people are going to make mistakes. And one of the challenges of saying that you want to be great and good is that every time you stumble, someone is going to say, well, that's neither great nor good, but that's fine. You should invite that kind of accountability, because it's only by identifying the goal that you can motivate people to at least aspire to that goal. And it's the aspiring and the striving towards the goal that's as important, I think, as the goal itself. So to close this out, absolutely, universities are and should be about discovering and disseminating new knowledge. They should be about preparing students for their careers and for meaningful lives. These should undoubtedly continue to be our primary goals. But we are also large institutions that impact the environment, that shape our communities, and affect the lives of thousands of people. At a time when other large institutions are taking a broader view of their responsibilities in order to regain the public's trust, I think it's imperative that universities do so as well. And that is essentially what we're trying to do at UVA, where our governing board recently approved the adoption of a 10-year strategic plan called, as I'm sure you'll be surprised to hear, the 2030 Plan, A Great and Good University. I hope you'll follow us on this imperfect journey. Thanks for listening, and thanks for having me. I like the moving around part.
There you go.
Yeah.
You know, right? Every 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's, exactly like a fourth grade classroom. It's DC. So, Jim, first off, terrific. Love it. It seems to me the kinds of remarks that can and should have and might have been given 10 years or 40 years ago, because the principles you enumerate seem relatively timeless. So, but given that aspiration, why is it that the public is so dissatisfied with higher education today? What's changed from 10 or 20 or 30 years ago?
Well, some of the things I mentioned before, I think the escalation of tuition and the explosion of student debt, which captures a lot of more attention today than I think it did 20 years ago. And one of the things that has not yet been a part of that conversation, which I think will be over the next few years, is time to graduation and completion. I mean, the idea that the 6-year graduation rate, the 6-year graduation rate is 60% is scandalous, if you think about it. And the student debt problem that you hear so much about is mostly a completion problem. Right? The students who have the most difficult time paying back debt are ones who have taken on some debt but haven't earned a degree. So that's number one. I think the high-profile flare-ups around speech, which have captured a lot of attention, I think that's caused a lot of people to wonder what is going on college campuses today. And the debates about conservative speakers and safe spaces and all that. I mean, I think it just plays into this overall narrative that something's going wrong on college campuses. And then I think another piece of this, which I didn't talk about, is this, well, I talked a little bit about the general sense that these places are elitist and for other people. They're not, as much as universities talk about being accessible and affordable, they're really not. I think about the town I grew up in. The people there wouldn't have thought that an elite university was for them. And so there's this sense that this is just the other.
So something other than cost.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's about the admissions process. So the Varsity Blues scandal, I think, just played into this idea that the system's rigged.
When you talk about good, one of the obvious issues that arises is we've got competing notions of good. On some things, like sustainability and protecting the planet, it's easy to see where there's lots of common ground. On some of these other issues, like some of these free speech fights, one of the consequences is that they're a product of people having very polarized notions of what's. So how do you think about universities negotiating?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's something that I thought about as we were developing this idea and thinking about all the time. I think that you have to. You absolutely have to allow and encourage debates about what is good, right? That being great and good in some instances, like you say, is pretty easy to define, right? So environmental sustainability is a good example. Or take athletics, right? I think one of the strengths of UVA is that it has really strong athletic programs, but they have remarkable coaches who instill really good values in their players, right? So it's easy to understand what it means there. But But when it comes to something like speech, you would never suppose that there needs to be a uniform conception of the good so people can't debate about it. Instead, I think what being great and good means is you not only provide the opportunities for robust debate, but you take that as part of your mission, right? So when I talked earlier about one of the ways that we can provide long-term value to the public is we can prepare our students to be civically engaged. We can prepare our students to be comfortable confronting, debating differing views. We can prepare our students to be comfortable living and learning from people who are different from them, where they absolutely will have different conceptions of the good.
I mean, one of the tricks, I guess, and it's one of the sources of distrust, certainly, among those of us on the right in particular, but higher ed, is that we know from surveys, from self-declaration, that universities are not an ideological mirror of the American public.
No.
They, faculty tend to have ideological predispositions that tend to the progressive side of the spectrum. University, the vision of professionals and of researchers generally tends to be more of a globalist mindset, that we're here members of a community of scholars and thinkers around the globe, rather than of the town in which we live. And certainly, I mean, that creates inevitable town-gown tensions, but particularly, I think, severe town-gown tensions when the ideology, when the rhythms and norms of the surrounding community or state host very different values and views and values.
Yeah.
I mean, it just strikes me as, I'm interested how you think about this as you think about, working through this tension in different environments.
Yeah, I thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction about.
Answer the one I would have gone, and then.
Let me answer the question that I thought you were asking, and then the question that you actually did.
I
I thought you were going to ask, how can you, promote robust debate if, the faculty are primarily left of center. I think it's slightly overblown, the idea that there isn't robust debate. I was just in a classroom 2 days ago on the Supreme Court, and 12 students in a seminar, and one of the things that I found just terrific is that the professor was clearly beloved by the students. As he was introducing the students, he said, "Okay, that's our wild Democrat, that's our conservative Republican," and the students were totally fine, like they were completely comfortable and totally happy having a debate. I think it's incumbent upon faculty to make sure that they do whatever they can to bring in opposing viewpoints. Faculty aren't always successful at that, but I think that's really important. In terms of the relationship with the rest of the community. So one of the, and I can't speak to this generally, I can speak to it in Charlottesville. One of the things that I heard from a lot of community members is that the research that's done in Charlottesville, the results are rarely shared. And so you have community members who are research subjects, but the benefits of that, they don't see the benefits of the research. And so that seems like a pretty straightforward problem to solve, right? So I think some of it is about figuring out ways to pair faculty interests in research with problems that local communities are facing. And so one of the things that we did just a few months ago was open the Equity Center, which is really focused on inequities in Charlottesville. And it's committed to working with community members to identify problems that they're trying to solve, not just problems that are of interest to researchers. I mean, you probably know this from schools research, right? There's often a mismatch between what an education researcher is interested in and the problem that the principal would identify, right? And this is sort of flipping that model on its head and going to the community and say, okay, what are some of the problems you're facing, and can we, through our research, help? And I think that can go an enormously long way to closing the divide between universities and the towns that they're in. It's a way of sharing the resources that exist in universities. And one of the things that I think ought to be the case and is not always and not nearly as often as it should be, For someone who's just growing up in Charlottesville, you should feel like you have an unfair advantage because the University of Virginia is there.
On that, the Equity Center question, one thing that comes up is on some of the examples you were talking about, I think it was precision research in biomedicine.
Precision medicine, yeah.
Precision medicine. Those feel very far removed from some of the debates that, we argue about in a polarized country.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are some of these issues that, particularly in areas like criminal justice or anti-poverty or education or even public health, that touch on hot-button issues around gender and your race. And on those, you made the point that, right, we've always wanted talented teachers to help students engage constructively and robustly on these issues.
Yeah.
But a related issue is, and again, I mean, you've been dean at Harvard Ed, you're president of UVA, you have a perspective on this. It feels to me from the outside that there are lines of research and lines of inquiry that are very hard to pursue on a bunch of these issues at universities. That if you are enthusiastic about restorative justice and school discipline, for instance, that it's very easy to get a job, very easy to get funded. That if you're skeptical of this, it cuts very different. And I wonder, when we talk about universities being seen as partners for communities with different values, as being seen as practical and authentic, how much of an issue is that and what can be done about it?
Yeah, I don't know, frankly, how big an issue it is. I mean, I know it exists, but I don't know how big an issue it is. I mean, in my view, it shouldn't be. I mean, so that to the extent it exists, it's a problem, right? I mean, I think that universities ought to be the places in the country where it's fair to pursue any question. But you're right, some questions, and I don't think this is anything new, but some questions are more in vogue than others for whatever reason. Just sort of the current flavor or ideology, and that's not as it should be.
So one last question, and let's open it up. When you're thinking about this great and good vision, what role, if any, the presidential candidates have been obviously talking about a variety of higher ed initiatives. What role for federal policy is there in this vision that you've sketched, or not?
You tell me. You're in D.C. You're the expert.
Oh yes, we're always the expert on these things. What's your take?
No, seriously. I'd be interested to hear what you think.
I have such great faith in Washington's ability to make everything better. Let's open this up for questions.
So I'll give you one example. I mean, the Pell amount hasn't changed in forever. I think that's a pretty small thing that they could do.
Okay, please catch the eye. We've got, who's working mics? Hannah and Brendan. Please catch them. When you grab the mic, please do me a favor. Please identify yourself by name and affiliation, and then please ask a question. If we get 15 seconds in and I can't figure out what the question's going to be, we'll give somebody else a shot. Yes, sir.
I'm Michael Polyakov from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Thank you for being here. Given these surveys, The Atlantic had one just a few days ago about student self-censorship and unwillingness to share ideas that they think might be out of the mainstream. Do you feel that the University of Virginia main campus, I know WISE has already done that, should be adopting the Chicago principles of freedom of expression or something like that to give an institutional commitment to the free exchange of ideas to ensure that it's something that is recognized as policy?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've had that question before. I've thought about it. There are parts of the Chicago statement that I think are very good. Parts of it not so good in my view. But stating something similar is something that I've thought about. I will say that there's a group, I think it's called FIRE, that ranks UVA very highly on this topic. So comparatively, we're doing quite well. But the problem of self-censorship is a real one. And again, I think that it's incumbent on us as administrators and as faculty to encourage and provide opportunities, not just for students to engage in debate, but also to model it. So, one of the things that we've been thinking about is how to put on a series of debates across a host of topics. We did something like this at the Ed School because education is filled, as you know, K-12 education in particular, is filled with hot button debates. And we thought, well, why don't we demonstrate to our students how, it's a little bit like the book that you're working on now, how people on different sides of an issue can debate one another, to kind of create an open space for people where they don't feel like they can't say something out of fear of causing offense. But that is a real issue on campuses around the country. I have 3 kids in college, and I talk to them about this all the time. And they will say, I wouldn't go near that topic. And that's unfortunate, right? That is not as it should be. Thanks for the question.
Anna.
Grattan Brown, Thales College. I have a question about your student debt number, which I think was average $25K on graduation.
Yeah.
Does that include parental debt taken on through things like PLUS loans? And if not, is that an important number? How much would it go up?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's just student debt. And I don't know what the figure is for family debt, but that's a very good point.
Brendan.
Hi, Jesse O'Connell, Lumina Foundation. I was really struck by your comment about people in the town that you grew up in having trouble seeing themselves in a particular education setting, and how that dovetails with all the emerging research around education deserts. I'm glad that Michael mentioned UVA Wise. Can you talk a little bit about UVA's experience opening that campus in Wise and what you hope to do beyond that, and can it set an example for others?
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, and this may include some UVA alums, the college at Wise is part of UVA since the late 1960s. And it's in Wise, Virginia, which is far southwest Virginia. Very rural area, facing really difficult times given the decline of the coal industry and facing all the challenges that you hear about in rural America, from joblessness to poverty to high levels of opioid addiction. Wise is a bright light in that county. 90% of the students receive financial aid. 50% of the students are the first in their families to go to college. It is an incredibly inspiring place. When I go there, I mean, this is going to sound corny, but when I go there, I feel like, okay, this is watching the American dream come to life. But it's struggling. It's like other small liberal arts colleges. Its enrollments have declined over the last 5 to 7 years, and the population base around Wise is declining. So we have been working on ways to increase enrollment through a number of different initiatives, and we'll continue to work with Wise to make sure that they have a good foundation for success, because I think that's an important part of our mission, actually. The other aspect of this that we've been doing more about and will continue to do more about, and I think that this is a good example of the right and smart thing to do, is expanding our programs through our School of Continuing Professional Studies. We have a bachelor's completion program for students who have earned some credits and need more to graduate. They have a series of certificate programs for non-traditional students who have either already attended a 4-year institution and need retooling for career advancement, or haven't and need to gain some skills for employment. I think that this is a burgeoning area and an opportunity for us to serve a much larger number of students that not only generates revenue for us, but also provides skills and credentials to non-traditional students who need them. So the idea of who has access to a UVA education through what we do at Wise and through the School of Continuing Professional Studies can be a lot broader than it has been in the past. And that's both through in-person classes and online.
Hannah.
Hi, thanks very much for coming today. My name's Chris Scalia. I work here at AEI, but I was actually, I'm a recovering faculty member at UVA Wise, actually. I left there a few years ago.
No way.
So, yeah.
Oh.
In fact, still trying to sell my house down there, speaking of economic recovery. So if any of you guys are interested in a mountain home, talk to me after this. So I'm approaching this from the perspective of a professor, a faculty member, especially when you say that that students are customers. Or at least, in this formula, with the shareholder statement, you kind of put them in that. And it makes sense as far as thinking about value and debt and return on investment and things like that. But I think it raises problems when you get to, the purpose of the primary purpose of a university, which is disseminating knowledge and making sure that students are actually learning. And there are studies that suggest, an old study, the 2011 one, Academically Adrift, showing that students aren't actually learning all that much. So if that's the primary purpose and it's not happening for all sorts of reasons, I think one of them is probably grade inflation and just kind of when we think of students as customers and treat them that way and they begin to see themselves that way, problems.
Yeah, it's a great question, I wouldn't stretch the analogy so much to say that we should treat students like customers. I was suggesting that you should substitute students for customers, and we should provide value to our students. But I don't think we provide value to our students by treating them like customers. I have a colleague who said, they're not our customers, they're our product. And in some respects, that's about the purpose of a university. And our purpose ought to be to prepare students for the rest of their lives. We ought to be paying attention, obviously, to whether our students are actually learning the things that we've set out to teach them. Some of those things are easy to measure. Some of those are much harder to measure. And I think I'm maybe more optimistic than you about what students are learning. And I think a lot of it isn't apparent until you talk to students who are 5 or 10 years out and they reflect back on what their experience was like and talk about, and I was just with a group of alums at the CIA this morning, and I can't tell you any more than that, but hypothetically, they talked, and I asked them about, how well did UVA prepare you? And they mentioned a number of things, some related to class, but some related to the strong tradition of student self-governance at UVA. So when you think about what are students gaining from their college experience, I think you have to think about it holistically. Yes, absolutely what they're learning in class, and they should be learning things in class, but also what are they learning from each other? What are they learning from the experience? What are they learning from participating in student self-governance? And that's why and all of those things together, at the very least, should leave students 5 or 10 years later feeling like this was a really good investment. And sometimes you can't tell whether it was a good investment until 5 or 10 years later. I'm really fortunate to be the president of UVA because UVA does pretty well in that regard. I mean, there's a reason why we have incredibly devoted and loyal alums, because a lot of them think that the experience changed their lives for the better.
Brennan.
My name's Eric, also from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. You mentioned that 23 of the top 25 universities were 100 years or older. You noted how they have a longer lifespan than major corporations, and that's a good thing. I'm just hoping to entertain the idea that possibly that's a bad thing, that maybe universities should be more like corporations and go out of business more often. It sounds like potentially those major universities have too much market power. There's not enough competition. There's therefore no creative destruction. If you believe in free markets, maybe they should go under and be replaced by more successful universities.
Jim?
I disagree. Next. No. I think you're starting to see the kind of competition you're talking about, for better or for worse, right? So the number of colleges that are closing or merging are much higher than they have been at any point in the last 25 years. And some of that is because of competition from other providers. not just providers of a 4-year degree, but providers of alternative credentials. So I think you're going to see the kind of competition that you're talking about. I still think that places like UVA and places like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, UNC, Michigan, Wisconsin, I mean, I think they're providing a pretty great product, and they provided it for a really long time. It's a minor point that I make only to annoy my business friends. I don't want to take it too far, but there's just a common refrain. If universities were only more like corporations, I'd be like, yeah, they'd be out of business in 50 years.
Hannah?
Thank you, Rick.
Hey.
Hi, President Ryan. I'm Greg Shuckman from the University of Central Florida
Yep.
and a Sorensen alum.
Yep.
The topic that you have about universities and corporations, I thought the question was going to turn to you about whether we need to adopt a model that corporations have of having lifelong customers. And so the one and done concept that we do in educating our students, do we need to think of them and have this lifelong learning relationship as they have to retool for the new industries of the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for asking it. And in some respects, it goes back to the question about whys and non-traditional students. Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about expanding what we provide through the School of Continuing Professional Studies at UVA, that's a perfect home for what people call lifelong learning. And you could imagine all sorts of models. I mean, we've batted around these ideas, but aren't anywhere close to launching them, because you need to figure out a model that works. But you could imagine models where when students come to college, they're signing up for a lifelong relationship by having access to continuing programs, whether they're online or they're on campus. And I'm not talking about a master's degree or a PhD, but a certificate program in a tech field. I bet you're going to see this. I haven't seen any super promising models yet. I mean, there's an awful lot of talk about lifelong learning, but I have not yet seen a university that, in part because you wouldn't know if it's lifelong if it starts now until like 50 years from now. So, but yeah, absolutely. I think that that's one way to add value to a student's experience, is making it clear that I think you want to get to the point where if one of your alums is thinking about changing jobs, the first place they think of is the university that they went to as being helpful in that regard. We're not there yet, but I think that's how I think about lifelong learning, at least one aspect of it.
Hello. Hi. What do you make of the...
Introduce yourself, please.
my name is Sarup. I'm an intern here at AEI. What do you make of the larger out-of-state numbers at state universities? And what do you respond to the criticism that it's easier to get into a state university if you're out of state?
That it's easier to get into a state university if you're out of state?
That's the perception. Like, what do you respond to?
Oh, that perception is not reality. It's much harder. I mean, I can speak to UVA. So UVA is 30% out of state, 70% in state. 2/3 of our applications come from out of state applicants for 30% of our slots. It's much harder to get in, if just by sheer numbers, if you're out of state than if you're in state. We have been talking about whether there are opportunities for us to have some flexibility on the in-state and out-of-state enrollment. Right now, the Commonwealth of Virginia provides about 10% of our budget. So 90% comes from other sources, and yet 70% of our students come from Virginia. University of Michigan is closer to 50%.
Hi, thank you again for coming. My name is Jane Cook. I work here at AEI. And my question is, how do you feel that UVA supports your first generation college students? And do you feel that this is adequate at this point? And is this an area in which you'd like to see grow under your presidency?
Yes. I feel like that question was planted. I think we do a good job. I think we could do better. We have So as I think about first-generation students, and this is what we're mapping right now, I think if you want to be serious about it, you have to think about, well, what are you doing before students even apply? Like, how are you creating a pipeline? And then what are you doing in the admission and recruitment and financial aid side? And then what are you doing on the support and advising side? And we actually have a program that brings in about 80 first-gen students from the local counties, starting in 9th grade. About a third of them end up coming to UVA. Most of them go to college somewhere, but about a third of them do. I think that's a great model that we could expand on. With respect to admission and recruitment, some of that really is just about getting the word out and being more aggressive with counseling, which is really just a question of resources, but it means going to schools, especially around Virginia, even when the yield is not going to be that high, which is, really, again, it's just about resources. With financial aid, it's about being generous with financial aid. And here, I'm completely thrilled to say that in October, we received a gift of $100 million, the bulk of which is going to be for scholarships for first-generation students. And I think that not only helps financially, obviously, but it also sends a signal that this is a place that would like to enroll first-generation students. Then on the advising and and sort of academic and career advising pieces of it, that's, I think, where we need to pull pieces together that exist across the university into a more holistic approach to students. And it raises a number of challenging issues, which is, to what extent do you single out first-generation students? To what extent do you simply provide advising, academic or career, to anyone who needs it? I tend to think you want to do the latter, even if you create social opportunities for first-generation students. But that's sort of what we're walking through. I mean, to make a long story very short, what I think you need to do is have a sort of soup to nuts approach, and that's what we're working on.
Jim, last question. Everybody's in favor of being good until it hurts.
Yeah.
What's the one thing, as you were working with your board on this, as you've been noodling on this, what's the one thing that immediately strikes you that's going to hurt and that people have to deal with?
Cost, honestly. It costs more money if you pay employees $15 an hour, and that money has to come somewhere. It costs more money if you're bringing in more first-generation students, and if you're trying to attract more Pell-eligible students. It costs more money if you become more generous about billing and collections. And so one of the challenges is to, because I think part of being great and good is offering a good value to students. At a certain point, you're putting pressure on tuition. And so some of this is balancing out those competing demands. And that's hard. I mean, we live in a resource-constrained environment. Every organization faces it. Those are the hardest challenges, is when you have competing demands for limited resources. And that just becomes difficult.
Jim, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks.